Okay, today's daf we are learning is Pesachim Daf Gimel. Today's daf is dedicated by Suri Stern, and thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Baruch Rofei Cholim, and by Yossi Zimmelover in honor of Tali Zimmelover, in honor of our first anniversary, and Tali's continued dedication to the daf and Torah learning. And by Stephen Perlin in honor of Alana Perlin. Mazal tov to my wife Alana Perlin on her siyum on Masechet Eruvin. I'm so proud of you, and Mazal tov to Judy Levitan, Yasher Koch on your siyum as well. Mazal tov to all those who finished and are now part of this new Masechet, and all those who are new. Welcome back to everyone. Okay, we're starting Meitive at the very bottom of Pesachim Daf Bet Amud Bet. If you recall, we started the Masechet. We said it starts in a bit of a strange manner. Today is going to continue. Tomorrow we'll get to more typical Gemara style. For today, we are continuing in this issue about the first word of the parak. The first word of the Masechet that starts off or la'arba asar, which means the night of the 14th. Oops, I gave it away. But right, that's already, we seem clear that that's the situation. And we had two opinions. Does it mean day or does it mean night? Right? Or sounds like light, sounds like it would mean day. However, we're going to see that it really means night. We have 4 questions today, which are all going to be against Rav Huna, who says that or is day. So Meitive Marzutra. Marzutra brought the following source to contradict. Today, we're going to learn a whole bunch of different topics, which is, I think I mentioned this yesterday, that often in the beginning of Masechtot, we get into a lot of different topics. Many times Masechtot say, oh, there's a bunch that start off and bring all sorts of things that sound like this Mishnah, or often we just end up with a lot of different topics in the first few pages. Hamapelet or l'shmonim ve'echad. Okay, we're talking about a woman who miscarries. Okay, we need a lot of background to understand before we even go past these first 4 words. So you have a situation where a woman gives birth, she's supposed to bring a sacrifice. The way it works is if she gives birth to a male, so 7 days she's considered impure. That's her blood is impure blood. After that, she has another 33 days, which are considered pure blood. That means, according to Torah law, this is not what we do anymore, but according to Torah law, she is now, any blood she sees, she's not forbidden to her husband, like normal other menstrual bleeding, and the first 7 days of bleeding. After that, she's permitted to her husband. And then she goes to the mikveh. Between then, she's permitted to her husband, even if she bleeds. But what is that? Why is it considered dam of something, dam tohar? Well, the issue is that she can't yet go to the temple to bring her sacrifice. Only after the 40 days are over, on day 41, can she go to the temple. If she gives birth to a female, then it's going to be the same thing, but doubled. 14 days of dam tuma, impure blood, then 66 days of dam toha. On day number 80, she can go bring, on day number 81, after 80 days pass, she can go to the temple and bring her sacrifice. If she were to have miscarried, now miscarriages also, you have to bring a korban leda, a sacrifice of birth, if the fetus had already developed more than 40 days. This is why we're not going to be discussing this in the sense of the 40 days if she gave birth to a male, because there's no way she would have a child that was already 40 days, a fetus that had developed 40 days. So we're going to have a situation where the woman gave birth to a female, and within that time period, before she was obligated to bring her sacrifice, she miscarries. If that's the case, then she only has to bring one sacrifice for both. One can cover, since she's within the time before she even becomes obligated to bring the sacrifice, she only brings one. But what if she has a miscarriage on or lishmonim ve'echad? That means on the 81st day, she becomes obligated in a sacrifice. However, the question becomes, when does the obligation kick in? Why is there a question? Well, sacrifices, if you recall, can only be brought during the day. So even though halachically the night is the same as the day, right? The day starts at night. If it's on the 81st, the night of the 81st, well, the question becomes, is she still within, she hasn't yet become obligated in the sacrifice, and therefore can bring only one sacrifice. That's what Beit Shammai says. Hamapelet or lishmonim yom. Okay, so that was all to understand those first 4 words. If she miscarries on the 81st, night of the 81st, Beit Shammai potrimi korban. Beit Shammai, he's actually lenient here. You don't have to bring a separate sacrifice. One sacrifice covers both. Ubeit Hillel mechayvim. Beit Hillel say you have to bring a new one. Okay, we're going to see why in a minute. Amru Beit Hillel Beit Shammai. Maishna or shmonim ve'echad miyom shmonim ve'echad. What's the difference? Now, already you can see where we're going, that or clearly means night. And here we're going to prove it in case it wasn't obvious from before. He says, what's the difference, Beit Hillel says to Beit Shammai, or shmonim ve'echad, the night of the 81st, miyom shmonim ve'echad, from the day of. That's why it's obvious, or means night, because he's comparing day to night. Im shiva lo l'tum'ah lo yishvelo l'korban. He says, if on the 81st day, okay, now there's one more point that I forgot to mention, which is, if she bleeds on day number 81, okay, if she bleeds on day number 80, that's called dam tohar. She's not forbidden to her husband. But if she bleeds on day number 81, that's already not dam tohar. She's left the potential days of the blood being pure, and she now would be considered, it would be blood that would make her impure because it's past those 80 days. So if on day the night of the 81st day, she's already going to be considered as if she's beyond her 80 days for the sake of tuma, impurity, lo yishvelo lekorban, then obviously for the sacrifice, she should have to bring a new sacrifice. We're clearly saying we're done with those days, we're on to new days. So the main point for our purposes being, right, if we were learning those sugyot, then we'd be dealing with this even more, but we're finished with this. And all we're trying to say right now is, mitika amar Beit Hillel Beit Shammai, maishna or shmonim ve'echad miyom shmonim ve'echad, shma mina or tahu. So now it's obvious from the discussion they were having that or means the night of, shma mina. And therefore that's clear. Okay, this is again one of the rejections that doesn't get resolved. This is clearly a rejection of that opinion. Meitive, next contradictory source. Yachol yehena echal or l'shlishi, vidinhu. Now we're gonna, again, we're starting a whole new topic. We have to give some background. There's different types of sacrifices. There's certain sacrifices like a korban olah, a burnt offering, which get entirely burnt and not eaten. Then there's other sacrifices that get eaten. So some of them, there's different time periods in which these need to be eaten. So certain ones get eaten for the day that you sacrifice them. Remember, sacrifice are only during the day. So that day where you bring the sacrifice and the night after. Some sacrifices get eaten, which is like the korban shlamim, which get eaten 2 days and the night in between, meaning the day you sacrifice, the night of, and you get an extra day. Okay, but now the question's going to be, when you get the extra day, do you get the day and the night after the day, or just the day? So now we're going to see. And now the other law you need to know, which we're going to discuss, is something called notal. Notal, we're going to see many, many times in the Talmud. Notal means if you leave it over beyond the allotted time that you're supposed to eat it, then it needs to be burnt. Okay, that's problematic. You're not allowed to leave it over. And if you do, that meat has to be burnt. So now we say, Yachol yehena echal or l'shlishi. You might have thought it could be eaten on the night of the third day. Okay, this is exactly what I said before, but now we're going to see. Okay, again, or we're going to see, it's obvious from here, it means the night of. So what does that mean? It means you get the day, you bring the sacrifice. We're now talking about a korban shlamim, which is the offering that the owners get to basically eat the meat of, most of the meat. So what happens? You get the day you sacrifice. That's day number 1. You get the night and the following day, which is day number 2. Now we talk about the night leading into the third day. So you might have thought you can eat it that night, vidinhu, and it would be logical. Zvachim ne'echalim liyom echad, ushlamim ne'echalim l'shnei yamim, right? We have some sacrifices that are eaten only for 1 day, some that are eaten for 2 days, the shlamim. Ma lahalan laila echad, ma lahalan laila achar hayom, afkan laila achar hayom. Just like on the 1 day ones, you get to eat them the day and the night after. Right? The ones that you can eat for a day and a night, you basically eat the day you sacrifice it, and you get the night also. So therefore, you might say here also, since you get the second day, maybe you would get the second night also. Talmud Lomar, but the verse comes to teach you that's not the case. The verse says, B'yom zivchachem yeachel, umi mochorat, v'hanotar ad yom, etc. Okay, we're not going to read the rest of the verse, but the point is, because it says here, it says, right, you eat it the day you sacrifice it, and the next day, and then it says, and the leftovers until the next day, and we're basically going to say, until the next day, need to get burnt. But they learn from these words, ad yom, teaches you be'od yom hu ne'echal. It's just a drasha. It's not clear from the verse, but this is how often we connect halachot to the verses. So ad yom they darshan as be'od yom, while it's still day. Okay, that it can only be eaten while it's still day. Ve'eno ne'echal la'or shlishi, and it's not eaten the night leading into the third day. So that's basically all we need for our purposes, but often as when they quote external sources, they bring the rest. Yachol yisaref miyad. You might have thought, well, if that's the case, then maybe you need to burn it at night. If it's leftover and you didn't eat it the day you were supposed to eat it or the following day, and now the day's over and you're not allowed to eat it at night, you should then burn it immediately at night. V'didu, and that would be logical because v'chim ne'echalim liyom v'layla echad. Ushlamim ne'echalim l'shnei yamim v'layla echad. Remember, some sacrifices get eaten the day of the sacrifice and the night right after. And the shlamim get eaten these are called peace offerings. They get eaten l'shnei yamim v'layla echad. They get 2 days and the night in between those 2 days. Mala halan techef l'achilas srefa, just like in the first category, as soon as you're forbidden to eat it, that's when the obligation to burn it kicks in. Soon as you can't eat it, right? You can eat it all night. Once the night is over, you're supposed to burn it in the morning. And that it says in the Torah, you're supposed to burn it in the morning. Hanotar mimenu ad boker ba'esh yisaref. Whatever's left over by the morning has to be burned. So afkan, likewise here, techef l'achilas srefa. You would think also as soon as the day is finished and you can no longer eat it, you should be burning it basically the night of the third. Talmud lomar, that's why the verse says, v'hanotar mibasar hazevach, whatever's left from the meat of the sacrifice, by yom hashlishi, on the third day, and notice it says day, ba'esh yisaref, should be burnt at night, which comes to teach you, by yom ata soref v'i'ata sorfo balayla. We burn it during the day, we don't burn it at night. Okay, and that's Mitika Amar. Now, what's the point of this whole thing? Mitika Amar Yehena Echal or Lishlishi Alma or Ortahu. So now we learn that or is night. Now this is funny because they say we're trying to prove is or day is or night. And what word does the Gemara choose to say? It's obvious it's night. They use the word orta, which was now all of a sudden it becomes obvious that even in the times of the Talmud talking, right here, they're questioning the language of the Mishnah. But in the time of the Talmud, they also called the night orta. Orta is a word for night. Okay, it's clear from here. So it's just kind of funny. Shma mina. So this is a clear proof also. Okay, I think this is our last source. Or maybe, no, there's 2 more sources. Tashma. Or shel Yom Kippurim mitpalel sheva. This you're going to find interesting for 2 reasons. This source, it kind of sounds a little boring in the beginning, but we're going to see there's 2 very interesting things about this source that we're not going to delve into, but you can delve into on your own if you want, or we'll see this again when we get to it in Yoma. Or shel Yom Kippurim mitpalel sheva. Okay, again, we're going to see clearly, or here means the night of, meaning at Arvit, okay, for the night prayer on Yom Kippurim. On Yom Kippur, you daven 7. What does that mean? Right? Normally we have Shmona Esrei, 18 blessings, which are really 19 now. But when it's holiday, you usually do 7. The 3 beginning, the 3 end ones, which are always the same, and the 1 middle blessing that's all about Yom Kippur. Umitvadeh. And you add a vidoy, right? That's the confession that we say on Yom Kippur. Shacharit mitpalel sheva umitvadeh. In the morning, you also do the same thing. Ube musaf mitpalel sheva umitvadeh. That's why I say it's a little bit boring, right? They're basically saying, okay, this prayer you say 7, this prayer you say 7, this prayer you say 7. Ube mincha mitpalel sheva umitvadeh. Okay, here comes the interesting part. First of all, you're going to see the ne'ilah doesn't appear here. That's number 1. And the next thing is ba'arvit mitpalel me'en shmona asar. When it comes to the nighttime prayer after Motzei Yom Kippur, we say Me'en Shmona Asar. What's Me'en Shmona Asar? If you remember from Brachot, we learned this a long time ago. It's what we call Havinenu, which is the shortened blessing that you say when you kind of don't have enough time to pray, right? This is very interesting because what's this telling us? That basically when Yom Kippur's over, we all struggle with that last prayer, right? And everybody's hungry and everybody wants to eat. And yet you now have to say, we've davened all day long and now you have to say Arvit. So according to the Tanakh here, you say a shortened version because everybody wants to eat. And we've been praying all day and, it's time to eat. So let's say the shortened version, which is basically the 3 blessings, the first 3, the last 3, and the middle blessing is 1 blessing that incorporates everything from all the middle blessings. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel omer mishum avotav, but he passes down in his father's name. Mitpalel shmona asar shlemot. You have to say all of them. Why is that? Mipnei shetzarich lamar havdalah b'chonen hadat. Because in the fourth blessing of Shmona Esrei, the first middle blessing, and at the end of every holiday, Shabbat, you have to add a special blessing of Havdalah. And you can't add that into Havinenu. There's no option. So therefore, you can't do it. Okay, even though maybe theoretically we'd like to allow you to do it, but we can't because you have to add that blessing. And that's why, in fact, we don't do this. Okay, we actually daven a regular davening. Alma, but again, let's go back to the beginning of this. Or to, right? So there were two interesting points. One is that there's no Ne'ilah mentioned here. And two is that there was this opinion that you could say a shortened version of Shmona Esrei after Yom Kippur. So in any case, what do we see? Or Shel Yom Kippurim is very clear from here that or means the night of. Shma Mina. Again, a good proof. Tashma, our last source. Ditane Debe Shmuel. In the house of Shmuel, they brought the following Braita. Lele arba'asar botkinet hachametz le'or haner. So now here, it's the exact same thing, but it says instead of or, it says lele, the evening of. So there you see it. You check for chametz, le'or haner, using the light, using a candlelight, alma, or tahu. So it's clear from here because it says lele, the nights of, right, night, we're going to get into this later on in the Masechet, nights, right, there aren't multiple nights of the 14th. It means from year to year. You would say, you would do b'dikat chametz at night. Ella. So now we have to go back to the beginning. If you remember yesterday when we started this whole sugya, the second line of the Gemara was, right, we said my or, just go back quickly. Rav Huna amar naghe, he said light. Rav Yehuda amar lele, night. Kasal kadatach, we thought, and whenever they say that, they're going to reject it. We thought that it meant that manda amar naghe mamash, that Rav Huna, who said light, meant morning, and Rav Yehuda, who said light, meant night. So now they say, Ella, we're going to understand this differently now because it can't possibly be that Rav Huna thought that this was going to be during the day. So therefore, Ella bein Rav Huna, bein Rav Yehuda, de kule alma or tahu. Everybody agrees that light is, that the word light here means night. V'lo pligi, and there's really no machloket. It's just linguistic issue. Mar ki atre or mar ki atre. Each person said it the way the wording was used in their place that they were living. Ba'atre de Rav Huna karenake. In the place of Rav Huna, they called it light, just like we saw in the Gemara. They called it orta. That's the word they used. Uba'atre de Rav Yehuda karu lele. But in the place of Rav Yehuda, they called it night. So it's just linguistic. It's each one chose what was used in their city. Betana didam my time alo katane lele. So now they want to know, why did our Mishnah, though, not just say lele? Lele appears in other places. We'll see Arvei Pesachim comes up. Why would they say lele? Lele comes up in many other sources, and certainly Tanaitic sources. So why didn't they just say that? It would have saved us a whole daf and a half. Lishnama al Yehuda. So they're basically choosing a nicer language. Okay. And we're going to see what this means. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, just like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, because he said, "La'olam al yotzi adam davar meguneh mipiv." No one should ever say anything not appropriate or not nice. Okay, it's going to be a little bit difficult to explain what he means by this, because you wouldn't have thought that the word night is a bad word, right? It certainly doesn't sound like a cursed word. But we're going to say that they want it. Now, if you remember back in Bracha, we learned all about how the night was a time of fear and danger and darkness, and it just has a bad connotation. And because of that, they wanted to change. Right? We even saw this in Brachot about Borei or, right? Yotzer or Borei Choshech, and maybe you shouldn't say Choshech. Right? That there's an issue of this is a word that we should avoid. And because they wanted to avoid this word about darkness, so they basically change it and they say or. Okay, it's what we call in Hebrew lashon sagi nahor. It's like a right, how do you translate it? It's kind of like a blind language, to blind ourselves and not to see this issue. So basically, we're going to say now it's very interesting because the Ravid says here very interestingly. He said there's really another reason. Okay, you wonder why the Gemara didn't say this according to him, but another reason is he wanted people to know that you're supposed to do it when it's still light. In other words, you do it at night, but when it's still a little light or the beginning of the night, that it was also referencing, he tries to add to this. It's not just that we want to change it and call it light. We want to use nice language, but in addition, he adds this other element, which is you're better off doing it before it's really, really dark. Remember, in those days, it really got very, very dark. There were no street lights or anything else. So he also adds that it's an issue to do it earlier in the night rather than later in the night. And maybe that's why there's a reference to or while it's still close to light or still light. So anyway, that's an additional thing. But this whole line now is going to take us to the end of the daf, which is all going to talk about the importance of language and how you speak. And you should choose nice words. And we're going to see there's some confusing things about this stuff, but we'll try to make it as clear as possible. But I'm going to raise some questions here about something that doesn't make perfect sense in the daf, which we'll have to leave. I don't have perfect answers for you about them. But in any case, we're going to start off with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Okay, there's basically two sources we're going to see. One is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who basically says you shouldn't speak anything that's miguneh, which is a disrespectful word, an inappropriate word. Again, what they're meant by inappropriate and what we might think by inappropriate words are very different, right? One would have thought saying the word night is not necessarily davar miguneh. Shneimar. Now we're going to see min habehema teora. Where do we learn this from? We learn it from verses in the Torah. We're going to have three different proofs for this. Min habehema teora u min habehema asher einena teora. This is from the animals that Noach brought into the ark with him. So he brought from the pure animals, umina behema asher einena tehora, and from the ones that are not pure, which is basically another word of saying impure. So now they're going to say Rav Papa. So we're going to see here. I think I skipped the whole line by accident. Shaharei ikema katuv shmona otiot. I'm going back a line. Sorry, I skipped. Ikema katuv shmona otiot v'lo hotzi davar maguneh mipiv. The Torah itself went out of its way. Now, this sounds major. And they added 8 letters as if that's a huge deal. And we'll see why that's a huge deal. But the Torah, the assumption is the Torah tries to keep things always concise. And if the Torah went out of its way to add 8 extra letters that should have been there, then that shows you that here the Torah went out of its way to add 8 extra letters. Clearly, we can't say davar maguneh mipiv. So what is that? Instead of saying impure, it said asher einena tehora. Should have just said asher tameh. Asher tameh would be asher, and tameh would be 3 words. And instead of those 3 letters, it says einena tehora, which is 10 letters. So here we're going to see, right? Why does it say shmona otiot? Mina behema. Oh, right. Sorry. It should have said mina behema hatme'ah, which is 5 letters. And instead it says asher einena tehora, which is 13 letters. So 13 minus 5, minus the 5, it should have said is 8. Rav Papa Amar Tesha. We're now going to have each one's going to one up the other. What do you mean? I'll give you a place where there's 9 letters that they went out of their way to use instead of saying it in a way that was less appropriate. Tesha shenema kiyeh b'cha. Oh, by the way, I should just point out, this is basically, the first proof is a very strange proof because it's saying the Torah doesn't say tameh because it's a bad word. Instead, it says asher einena tehora. Now, why is this strange? And we're going to see this later in the daf. There's many, many places. If you take out a concordancia, or nowadays you don't even need one of those anymore, a concordance, you can just look up on Google and see how many times the word tameh appears in the Torah, or go on Safari and just check tameh and click off Torah. You're going to see the tameh appears many, many places. And some people say, well, there's different tameh animals versus tameh people, that tameh people are not as bad, maybe because they can go to the mikvah like we saw the other day with the sherets. Maybe that's why. But even animals, right? When it lists all the kosher animals and the non-kosher animals, it says tameh, doesn't always say asher einena tehora. So a bit of a question about this. It seems like maybe this is, first of all, the first mention. Some people say we distinguish between before the Torah was given and after the Torah was given, that before those animals were really viewed as bad. Afterwards, they just became halachic category as in ones that we don't eat. Like I said, this raises a lot of questions, and particularly when we see in the Gemara later, but let's just put that aside for right now. So Rav Papa says 9. Shenemar, ki yeh b'cha ish, asher lo yeh tahor mikre laila. Okay, if you have a person who is not tahor mikre laila, something happens at night and they become impure. So now the question is, again, it says asher lo yeh tahor, right? It could have just said ki yeh b'cha ish tameh. So here you see they added, right? It should have said ki yeh b'cha ish asher tameh. And instead of saying asher tameh, it says, it should have said ish tameh. And instead of that, it says ish asher. So asher and tameh kind of, 3 letters. But now see how many letters are left. Lo yeh tahor, the extras, that's 10 letters. Well, that's a little strange. Rav Papa said 9. So we're going to see in a second that Rav Papa clearly didn't have a vav. This is very interesting in terms of different texts of the Torah that existed then, whether they have vavs or didn't have vavs. This comes up in the Torah in the Gemara a number of times, where the psukim they quote sometimes are different than the ones by us. So he has it as 9. Ravina Amar Eser. Ravina says, what are you talking about? It's 10, and he has the same the version that we have. Vav de tahor. You forgot about the vav of tahor. That makes it into 10. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar Sheshesre. He says, what are you talking about? I'll one up you guys even more. I found 16 extra letters, right? You might have thought 8 didn't sound like a lot. Now already we're 16, all of a sudden sounds like so many, even though again, we're talking about just letters, but you see how they went out of their way to add words. Ki amar mikrehu bilti tahoru, ki lo tahor. Okay, this is a verse in Shmuel Aleph. This is in the famous passage that we read called Machar Chodesh. We read it, the Haftorah of when Rosh Chodesh comes out the next day with David and Shaul says, the first night David didn't show up, I didn't make such a big deal about it. I didn't really make much of it. I thought it was, I said, Mikrehu bilti tahor, must have been he was impure and that's why he didn't come. Ki lo tahor. So again, instead of saying all that, he could have just said Mikrehu tameh. And then you have all these extra letters and that adds up to 16. Tanya debate Rabbi Yishmael. So that was our first source. Our first source was Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who said, Al yotzi adam davar meguneh mipiv. You shouldn't say something that's an inappropriate word. Now we say, Tanya debate Rabbi Yishmael. He also says, La'olam yisaper adam belashon nikiyah. You should always use a better language. Sha'arei bezav, kara'o merkav, u'bi'isha kara'o moshav. Okay, there's a zav and a zava. A zav has a clear discharge and it's a male, and a female has a bloody discharge. Both those are considered tameh, and they have certain types of tuma associated with them if they sit on something or ride on something. So by the man, it says merkav, that he rode, and by the woman, it says moshav, she sits. Why is this? Why is it a more appropriate word to use moshav by a woman? Because they say it's immodest for a woman to ride on a horse, on a donkey, with her legs spread. That seems immodest. So therefore, they talk about moshav as if she sits on the side, okay, with her body to the side, and that way she doesn't have her legs one on either side. So now they say, so that's number one, ve'omer, and additionally it says, v'tivchar lashon arumim. We're now going to quote 2 verses from Eov, that you should choose your language, the arumim, the clever ones. And they say the clever ones are the rabbis. Ve'omer v'dat sfatai baror milelu. And it also says in Eov that the things that come out of my lips should be stated. Now, the Koran translates this as sincerely, okay, but we're going to see that they darshan it to mean as appropriate language, better language, higher language. My ve'omer. So first they say, why do they need to bring both these verses? Tashma ve'omer v'tivchar lashon arumim. So they say, you might have thought maybe that's fatai barur milelu means when you're talking, when the Torah speaks. But tivchar lashon arumim is the rabbis, because we're saying arumim is a reference to the rabbis. Maybe you would have thought, maybe that's only when they're talking rabbi talk, but not when they're having average conversation. Maybe there's a certain type of conversation. When you're talking Torah, you should speak in a higher language, but when you're saying other things, you don't need to. Therefore, it says, it says, v'datz fatai baror milelu. Anything that comes out of your lips should be a higher language. Okay, so now they basically proved it from the woman, the zava, that it says moshav and not merkav, and from these 2 verses in Eov. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, ubi isha lo ktiv ba merkav, doesn't ever say that a woman's riding on an animal. V'haktiv, it says, vatakam rivka v'na'aroteha. We read this not very recently in the parsha. Rivka got up with her na'aroteha, vaterkavna ala gmalim, and they rode on the camels. So what do they, here you see, it says terkavna, by women. So what do they answer? Hata mishum bi'atuta digmalim orchahi. In that case, that was the typical way the women rode on camels. That's because it was scary to ride on a camel. It was likely you were going to fall off, and therefore the women were able to ride in that way. It wasn't, this is interesting, it wasn't considered immodest. This is a little bit like the end of Masechet Pesachim, where we had all these cases of people who weren't necessarily supposed to go into the temple, but if we had no choice, so they could go in, right? Like the Israelites shouldn't go in to fix things. Kohanim should do it, but if we didn't have Kohanim, we let Yisraelim. Likewise here, women shouldn't really ride in that way. But if they were, did I say, oh, sorry, the end of Eruvin. If this is what happens when you're a little jet lagged. But what they mean is that if the women would ride side saddled, if they could, but if they had no choice, like on the camel, they were scared, then they would ride normal. The haktiv, so now they say, wait a minute. V'haktiv. So you're saying only by camels this would be the case, but I'll show you another verse. V'yikach Moshe et ishto ve'et banav. Moshe took his wife and his sons. V'yarkivem ala chamor, and he rode them on donkeys. So here you see donkey, women riding. Seems like we shouldn't be using this language. So what do they answer there? Hata mishum banav orchahu. There he was mentioning his sons and his wife all together as one. Therefore, that was this is the generally in Hebrew they kind of go on the male as the average case, or here you had two sons and her. She was just mentioned along with them. But we're going to have more issues. This is Abigail, if you remember from Shmuel Aleph, Abigail with Naval, her husband, and then there was David, and she was running to David to say, please don't kill my husband. So hata mishum bi'atuta delelya orchahu. So now we're going to give three possible reasons why it says she was rochevet. One is she was scared of the night. She was doing it at night and she was scared. And therefore, again, when you're scared, if you ride side saddle, there's more of a chance you're going to fall off. So that's why. No, it wasn't that we were scared, she was scared of the night, but mishum bi'atuta de David, because she was nervous to be meeting David and to plead on her husband's behalf, and therefore she was scared. And therefore, again, as long as you're scared, then we assume that your typical way is going to ride in a normal manner. No, that wasn't the issue. Mishum bi'atuta de har ika. She was riding on a mountain, and because she was riding on the mountain, that's why she rode in that way. Now they're going to say back to what I mentioned earlier, which is this other issue of uba oraita mi lo ktiv tameh. Wait a minute. In the Torah, it doesn't use the word tameh. What are you talking about? Ela kol hecha dechiadad. So now the Gemara says, right, of course the Torah uses the language of tameh all the time. So you made this whole big deal to say that it never uses that word, and you have to use lashon nikiyah. But it doesn't, every time it says the word tameh, it doesn't say asher inena teorah. So the answer, and this is kind of where I said there's going to be something that doesn't make so much sense here. They're going to say, if the amount of letters would be equal, if you switch tameh and tahor, then, or anything like that, then you use lashon nikiyah. But but if it's going to cause you to have to say extra letters, then mishtai b'lashon ktsara, then you're better off saying it short. And that's why the Torah generally uses tameh instead of saying asher inena teorah. Now, why is this a problematic line? Because didn't we start by saying that they said asher inena teorah and they added letters just to teach us? So some people explain, and I'm going to kind of leave it because it's a really good question. Because the Gemara here seems to reject what the Gemara said earlier about how the Torah went out of its way to add extra letters. It could be that it did it the first instance to show us and teach us a value, a lesson about how we should speak. But otherwise, the Torah kind of keeps it short. Another explanation is that there's a difference between the description of going into the ark versus when we talk about halacha. When we're talking about halacha, and that's why this next line is going to be very relevant. We're talking about halacha when the Torah wants to teach us, okay, what animal is impure, what is not pure. How do we do it? They want to teach it in the shortest manner, and this is a good lesson for all teachers. Just like Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. Some people said that Rav Yehuda said it. Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, in the name of Rabbi Meir, the Tana. You should always teach things in the shortest way possible, because first of all, I think you can keep people's attention when you speak shorter. And number two, you're much more clear. If you add lots of words, it leads to definitely possibilities for people to misinterpret. So keep things as short as possible. So we kind of have a conflict of interest here. On the one hand, sometimes they add letters in order to keep the language pure. On the other hand, we have this issue that you have to shorten things. And maybe that's the issue. When they're talking halacha, we want to make sure it's very clear. And therefore, they went the shorter way. So only when you're not going to be adding extra letters, and the word Torah is always longer than the word tameh. And certainly if you want to say it's not tahor, that's why in general, the Torah does say tameh. So now they say, wait a minute. They're obviously going to question this. Well, if it's always going to be the same, right, then we're going to always use the better language. Go back to Abigail. It says she was riding. If you could switch rochevet with yoshevet, she was sitting, that would be better. And yet it says rochevet, and it's the exact same amount of letters. So they say, oh no, look at the word, rochevet ktiv without a vav. There it said shorter. Okay, of course you could have written yoshevet without a vav also, but the Gemara doesn't relate to that. Now we're going to have a whole bunch of them. We're going to finish our daf today with a lot of stories. And this is the way the rabbis like to express how important it is to be serious about this by, right? And it's interesting because it's not necessarily a halachic thing. Okay, some people, by the way, again, another one of the ways of explaining this distinction between the beginning of the Gemara and sort of the end here, where it seems to say the Torah does choose tameh. Sometimes also they distinguish between what lashon meguneh versus what's not, the way Rabbi Yishmael said it, which was lashon nikiyah, that maybe they're not exactly the same thing. Okay, again, I'm not going to get into all the details here, but just so you should know. So now we start our stories. Hanu trei talmidei. There were two students. Davuyatvu kamei de Rav. They were both in front of Rav. Chanamar. Okay, now they were having a long day of learning, right? Sometimes we have one of these really complicated tapim and you just feel dizzy by the end of it. So they were having one of those days. And they both said in a different language, Shavit and hai shmata ki davar acher mesankan. Well, I feel like a tired davar acher. What's davar acher in the Gemara? Often it means a pig. They don't want to say the word pig, so they use, it's funny. He was using a euphemism, but even the fact he was using a euphemism, since he was referring to himself as a chazir, Rav didn't like this, okay, as a pig. Some people say it's a tired pig. There's a bunch of different explanations given, maybe a fat, full pig, like I'm full, I've had enough learning, something along those lines. I feel like a kid that's tired or fat, full, etc., whatever it might be. But one used the language of a pig. So what do we see here? And Rav wouldn't listen anymore to the one who called himself a pig. Okay, he said that's not an appropriate way of speaking, and he wouldn't speak with him. Two students were sitting in front of Hillel. We'll see in a minute, maybe not necessarily in front of Hillel. One of them was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Some people say it was in front of Rebbe, not Hillel. And one of them was Rabbi Yochanan. So in other words, either they were sitting in front of Hillel and it was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, or it was sitting in front of Rebbe and it was Rabbi Yochanan. Chanamar. Okay, and the other one we don't know. And I think maybe you would say the Gemara is using Lashon Nikiyah by not telling us who the other one was. So, Chanamar mipnema botzrim betara ve'em moskim betara. This is a halacha. When you harvest grapes or you harvest olives, there's a big difference. When you harvest the grapes, there's a little bit of the juice that seeps out of the grapes. Since that can be used as wine, so as it seeps out, it's considered a liquid that can cause susceptibility to impurity. It has to be a liquid that you want to come out. When it comes to the olives, and therefore it can cause impurity, and therefore you can only put the grapes into a pure vessel. When it comes to olives, the liquid that comes out is not anything we use as oil. Only when you press them is it oil. But the beginning stuff that comes out, a little bit of liquid, comes on there. Nobody really wants that. It's usually bitter. So therefore, they can be put in impure vessels because when the liquid comes on, it's not liquid that we want or we're interested in. And therefore, it's not a liquid that can cause susceptibility to impurity. So each one asked the question, they just asked it differently. They wanted to know why, when you do the grapes, when you harvest them, you have to put them in pure vessels. But when you take the olives, they don't have to be in pure vessels. The other one said it, and why do we put the olives in impure vessels, or can we put them in impure vessels? So Amar Muftachani Bezeh Shemoreh Hara B'Yisrael. They said, they heard Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai say it in the nicer way. They said, I could see he's going to be a future teacher in Israel. And very soon after that, he became a very great teacher. Hanu Tlate Kahane. There were 3 Kohanim. Okay, now we get into, this is also a sneak preview into Yoma, where we're going to see all this rivalry between Kohanim, because between what jobs they get to do in the temple, between what foods they get to, how the foods get divided up, right? Like in any house, if we split things up and one kid gets more than the other, they get upset. Likewise, the Kohanim. So they're now getting pieces of the bread, the lechem apanim, the showbread in the temple. At the end of the week, the Kohanim got to eat it. So Chanamar, who one said to the others, Hagiani kifol, I got like a bean size. This isn't fair. V'Chanamar, Higiani kizayit, I got an olive size. V'Chanamar, Higiani kizanaf halita, I got like the tail of a lizard. That's really not an appropriate language. And therefore, Badku acharav umatzubo shemetz pasul. They checked after him and they saw that he had problematic lineage. Okay, so this Kohen was basically ended up, because he started speaking that way, they checked into his lineage and they said, this guy really can't be a Kohen. So now the Gemara questions this whole thing about what, he had bad lineage. Vaha, it says in a Braita, Hatanan or maybe Hatanya, Ein bodkim min hamizbeach ulamala. Once we see that his family served in the temple, we don't start questioning anymore. In other words, we assume that the lineage, this is a whole very interesting topic about assumption of correct lineage, which we're going to get to even more in the next story. We assume he's fine. So why were they checking into his lineage? So they say, Lo tema shemetz pasul, ela ema shachatz pasul. You're right. If they were serving in the temple already, it can't be there was a problem with his lineage. It must be he had arrogance that made him, if a Kohen is too arrogant, we don't allow him to be in the temple. This is very interesting. Not sure if this halach is quoted in other places, but they changed the mem to a chet and say it was something else. Alternatively, you could say, Shanehatam de iu de ara nafshe. It was, in a normal case, we don't start checking into someone's lineage unless they give us reason to believe that there's a reason to check into his lineage. And once he started speaking in that language, they realized maybe something was off and they checked in and they realized there was a problem. Ha'u aramai, there was a non-Jewish person, he would go and eat the Korban Pesach. Now, a non-Jew is not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach, but he would sneak in, pretend he was a Jew, and go eat with everybody else. Amar K'tiv, so it says, Kol ben echar lo yochal bo, anyone who's a stranger can't eat. Kol harei lo yochal bo, if you don't have a brit milah, you're not circumcised, you can't eat. Va'ana haka achilna mishufrei shufrei, and I ate with the best of the best. Amar le Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, Mika safulach. So now Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera realized that he's going to eat, and he wants to come up with a way to stop him. So he comes up with a very intelligent way. He says, Mika safulach me'alya, did they give you from the tail of the animal of the Korban Pesach? Amar lehu lo. He said, no, I never ate of the tail. Kisalik lahatam emalus. He says, when you go out there next, tell them safule me'alya, that you want to eat the tail. Kisalik, when he got there, Amar lehu me'alya safuli. He says, can you give me part of the tail? Amrule, alya legavos salka. What are you talking about? We burn the tail. Nobody eats the tail of the Korban Pesach. Amrule, man amrlechahachi. They said, where'd you get this idea from? Who gave you this idea that you came here and said, I want to eat the tail? Amar lehu, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera amaro. He said, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera told me. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, period. Amru, so the people there realized something was up. They said, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera wouldn't be telling someone to eat from the tail. He knows the halacha that you don't eat from the tail. So Amru, they said, hi, my dekaman, what's going on here? Something's going, there's something happening. But kubatre, so they checked into his lineage. So they saw he was a Gentile. And here's the big, right? This is the end of every good Talmudic story. It ends with death. Vikatluhu, and they sent him to death. Now the Mepharshim say, how on earth were you sentencing him to death? This isn't something you're worthy of the death penalty. Could be just Talmudic stories like to say that to kind of for punch at the end, This was very serious, and they killed him. Unclear exactly why he got killed. In any case, a very interesting sugya, and we're kind of at the end, but I really want to mention this because it's so interesting. This is used, Tosfot says, by the way, Mikan, if you look, Anachil mishufre shufre, Mikan ein ra'aya shenami kol haba lefanenu, v'omer Yisraelani. You can't prove from this, the very important halacha. Now he says you can't prove from here, you can prove from somewhere else. Very important halacha that you don't, if someone says Yisraelani, we believe them. And why is this so important? Because in Israel now, there's a huge issue about this with all the immigrants from the former Soviet Union who claim they're Jewish. And then there's a lot of we don't think you're Jewish, etc. So first of all, Tosfot says here was Shanei Hacha Derov Yisrael, the majority are Jews, which some people claim also. Most of the Jews that come and say we're Jewish are Jews, and therefore one should rely on that, and one shouldn't start questioning their lineage. And there's a whole debate about, and the Shulchan Aruch actually paskins this way, that if someone says I'm Jewish, we don't start questioning their lineage. However, today in the Rabbanit in Israel, there's a different approach, and it's a big question as to why there's a different approach and whether it's the right approach or not. Anyway, these are very interesting, relevant issues that come out of here. Okay, let's finish our last two stories. So first, the end of the story is Shalchule le Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, Shalem lach Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. They sent him a letter and said, "Wow, peace be with you. Da'at ben Nitzivin u'mutzudatech prusa b'Yerushalayim. You're all the way up north in Nitzivin, and yet your trap is set in Jerusalem. And as you figured out how to get this guy." Rav Kahana chalash. Rav Kahana got sick. He was old and sick. Shadrua Rabbanan Rav Yeshua berei Rav Idi. So the rabbi sent Rav Yeshua, the son of Rav Idi, Amr le zil bedok my dine. Go check how he's doing. When he got there, he saw he was no longer alive. Okay, I realized that I said he was no longer alive instead of saying he was dead, right? I've gotten used to the sugyats in my head about figuring out how to say things properly. So I did it without even thinking. But anyway, what happens? He tore his clothing and then he turned it behind him. He put the tear in the back, right? Normally you tear it by your heart. He turned it and put it on the other side. and he was crying and walking. Amrule. So when they saw him crying. They said, Nach nafshi, did he pass away? Amar lehu, ana lo ka'amina. I didn't say anything. Umotzi dibahu ksil. Anyone who tells about someone dying, he's a fool. In other words, he didn't want to say the words, even to express the death of it. He didn't want to be the one bearing the bad news, and that's why he put the tear on the back. Last story for today. Yochanan chakuka'a nafik l'kiryata. He went and he left the city. Ki'ata, when he came back to the city, amru lechitin na'asu yafot. They said, how's the crop going? The wheat crop, is it good? Amar lehu se'orim na'asu yafot. The barley's doing well. Right? Clearly, not exactly. Well, they weren't very happy with his answer, and they got very upset with him with his choice of language. Again, you see, choice of language is very important. Amrule, if you want to tell us about the barley, go tell the horses and the donkeys. We don't care about barley. Nobody eats barley. It's food for the animals. Right? The barley is for the animals. So what should he have said? Again, choosing language carefully. He didn't want to say the chitim are bad, but he also shouldn't have given them an example of things they don't eat. So he should have said, Eshtekad nasu chitin yafot. Last year, the crop was really good. Inami, or alternatively, he could have said, Adashim nasu yafot. He could have taken something they eat, like lentils, and say, well, the lentils are looking good. Okay, again, he didn't want to be the bearer of bad news and say it explicitly, right? And I think these last two stories are kind of a way of saying, right, say it to people gently, right? You don't want to be the one. Those are two pretty big things to tell people that would be very upsetting to people. Their crops are bad and their big rabbi died. So, say it gently and it will get accepted a little bit better. Of course, he said it in a way that kind of got them really annoyed at him. But anyway, this is all about choosing your language. Like I said, it's not a typical Gemara. If you're new to Gemara, you might be surprised by this. But we're going to get back to regular Gemara style soon. It's an interesting way to start off the Masechet, and a big question really, why the Masechet is spending 2 full dapim on one word or and choice of words. And it's obvious that this is an important value. Why it's here in Pesachim, I'm not exactly sure, but maybe because the whole story of Pesachim is about telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim and how you tell it and how you choose to use your language, is especially when it comes to, it's all about the holiday of chinuch and education. And maybe that's why they're telling us you have to be very careful how you choose your words. Have a great day, everybody.